The heat of the summer sun blazed down on a pristine suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns stretched out beneath perfectly aligned homes. The neighborhood, though seemingly idyllic, concealed an undercurrent of tension. Even the quiet hum of the sprinklers couldn't mask the subtle whispers of privilege and bias that circulated among its residents. At the heart of this quiet suburban paradise, a former CIA agent, now retired and seeking peace, stood beside his pool. The water shimmered under the sunlight, reflecting the tranquility he had longed for after years of serving his country. Calvin Morgan had spent his life fighting for justice, but now, in the privacy of his own backyard, he sought a different kind of peace, one free from the systemic racism he had fought against his entire life. But peace, he soon learned, was a fleeting illusion. As he stretched out on a pool chair, the soft sound of a dog's bark broke through the stillness. Calvin's brow furrowed, sensing something was amiss. His eyes moved instinctively to the side of the fence where the barking grew louder. And then, through a small gap in the gate, he saw her. Karen. Karen was the type of neighbor who, in Calvin's mind, epitomized entitlement. A woman whose presence was always loud, whether in conversation or in her actions. She stood near the edge of his pool, her small dog scampering around the tiles, completely ignoring the private property sign hanging just a few feet away. Calvin's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of the sense of indignation he had felt all his life. She had done this before, strolling across his property as if it were her own, claiming it was a mistake or misunderstanding. But Calvin knew the truth. It wasn't a mistake. It was entitlement, the kind that had been bred into Karen by privilege, the same privilege that made her feel as if she could step on anyone who stood in her way. "Excuse me, Karen," Calvin called, his voice calm yet firm as he stood, watching her with steady eyes. Karen looked up, startled, her sunglasses perched high on her nose. "Oh, Calvin, I didn't see the sign there," she said, her tone light and dismissive. Calvin clenched his jaw, but his voice remained even. "It's been there since I moved in. I've asked you several times to keep off my property." Karen tilted her head, offering a practiced half-smile. "Oh, come on, Calvin. You know I didn't mean anything by it. I was just letting my dog play." She waved it off, but Calvin could feel her subtle attempt to belittle his authority. "No, Karen, you know exactly what you're doing, and you've done it before." His voice grew more serious, an edge creeping in as he stepped closer, blocking her from continuing any further onto his property. "I've asked you to respect my space." Karen's eyes narrowed, but there was something more than just annoyance in her gaze now. Something almost mocking, as if she couldn't fathom the idea that Calvin, a man of color, would dare confront her about something so trivial. She lifted her chin, taking on a more confrontational stance. "Look, I don't have time for your attitude, Calvin. It's just a pool. I'm not doing anything wrong." For a moment, Calvin stood still, the weight of her words hitting harder than he'd expected. How many times had he been dismissed like this? How many times had his request for basic respect been ignored or belittled because of who he was? It was not just about the pool. It was about entitlement. It was about the way people like Karen felt they had the right to invade spaces that didn't belong to them. It was about systemic racism that manifested in the smallest actions, the ones no one ever talked about. "I'm not asking again," Calvin said, his voice quieter now but filled with authority. "Get off my property." Karen scoffed, flicking her hair over her shoulder as she stepped back, but the disdain in her eyes lingered. "You don't get to talk to me like that. I'm a longtime member of this community, Calvin. Maybe you should remember your place." Calvin froze. That was the moment. That was when it became clear. It wasn't just about the pool. This was about a lifetime of dealing with people like Karen, those who assumed they were superior simply because of the color of their skin. "You don't get to tell me what my place is," Calvin said, each word deliberate, carrying years of unspoken frustration. For a brief second, Karen looked at him, her arrogance faltering. But then, as if realizing that her privilege could not be questioned, she put on a sweet smile and turned, walking away without another word. But Calvin stayed there, his hands gripping the edge of the pool, staring after her as she retreated. As Karen disappeared behind the corner of his yard, Calvin's anger simmered. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about everything. The way she had walked onto his property as though he didn't matter. The way she had spoken to him, dismissing him as if he were insignificant. For all the years of fighting for justice, for all the things Calvin had done in his life, this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant confrontation, was the one that hurt the most. He had been to war, fought the battles that had shaped the nation's future, but this was the battle he couldn't ignore. This was personal, and he wasn't going to let it slide. The journey ahead would be tough, but Calvin knew it was time to make a stand. Not just for his own dignity, but for everyone who had ever been brushed aside because of the color of their skin. Calvin stood in his backyard, his eyes still fixed on the corner where Karen had disappeared. The quiet of the neighborhood felt deafening. The sounds of distant lawnmowers, chirping birds, and the occasional conversation from neighbors filtered through the air, but Calvin couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. He had been dismissed again, dismissed not for who he was or the life he had lived, but because of his skin color. This wasn't new to him. Far from it. As a black man who had climbed to the highest ranks of an organization like the CIA, he had often been made to feel small, invisible, or lesser. It wasn't just Karen's actions. It was the way she spoke to him. That air of superiority, like his presence, his authority, and his requests meant nothing. Her words echoed in his mind, each one sinking deeper. Maybe you should remember your place. The weight of those words was suffocating even now as they settled in his chest like a stone. It had happened again. The burden he carried from years of fighting in the shadows, the battles that no one saw, was now something he had to face head on. In some way, Karen's trespassing on his property wasn't even the point anymore. It was the statement she made, the message her indifference sent, that he was an outsider despite everything he had accomplished, that he was beneath her. He didn't move for a while. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the weight of every slight, every injustice had made it impossible for him to take the next step. This was his moment of reckoning, but it didn't feel like an epic battle or an angry confrontation. It felt like quiet despair, sudden, sharp, and crushing. It felt like having everything to say and nothing at all. He should have been prepared for it, but he wasn't. After a long breath, Calvin finally turned and walked back into the house. His mind raced, replaying the exchange over and over. He was used to fighting external battles, but how do you fight something like this? Something that seeped into every moment of your life, disguised as politeness, as just how things were. It wasn't just Karen, it was the whole system. And what hurt more was how few people around him seemed to understand that. Angela was in the kitchen when he walked in, chopping vegetables for dinner. She didn't look up immediately, but Calvin could see the way her posture stiffened when she sensed his presence. She knew. She always knew. I take it she was out there again. Angela's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something Calvin recognized as her own frustration with the way people like Karen treated them. Yeah, Calvin muttered, moving to the fridge. He reached for a bottle of water, twisting the cap off and taking a long drink. Angela didn't ask more, not yet. She could see he was carrying something, a weight she knew well. She let the silence stretch between them for a moment before she finally spoke again. "You didn't deserve that," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've given everything, and you're still treated like this." Calvin closed his eyes, a sharp breath escaping his lungs. "I know," he replied, the words catching in his throat. "But that doesn't make it any easier, does it?" Angela placed the knife down and walked over to him, her hands gently resting on his shoulders. Her touch grounded him in a way nothing else could. "We can't let them do this to us. Not anymore." "I don't know how much more I can take, Ange," Calvin admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's everywhere. It's in their eyes, in the way they talk, and how they move around me. All these years of service, and nothing's changed. No matter how many battles I've fought, they still see me as other." Angela squeezed his shoulders. "It's going to take more than just you fighting it, Calvin. You fought your whole life, but it's not just about you anymore. We got to fight together. All of us. You're not alone in this." Her words were powerful, But there was a flicker of doubt in Calvin's heart. Was she right? Could they really make a difference in a system built to keep them down? Could the people in this neighborhood, people like Karen, ever change? The thought seemed absurd. But then, something in the back of his mind clicked. What if the fight wasn't just about enduring this injustice, but exposing it for what it truly was? What if standing up to people like Karen, even in small ways, could start a ripple of change? He had stood on the front lines of dangerous operations before, but this was something different. This wasn't about going to war or taking down enemies in the shadows. This was about confronting racism head-on. It was time to stop letting his life be defined by how others saw him. Maybe you're right, Calvin said, his voice more resolute now. Maybe it's time I stopped standing still. The next morning, Calvin woke with a renewed sense of determination. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let Karen or anyone else like her think they could continue to walk over him. The fight wasn't just about his dignity. It was about exposing the ugliness of a system that had been built to hold people like him down. And he was ready. He had had enough. The next few days were a blur. Calvin spent more time than he wanted to admit dwelling on the conversation with Angela, his thoughts constantly circling back to Karen and what had transpired. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, smiling smugly, dismissing his presence like he was some insignificant obstacle in her way. Every time the memory resurfaced, it made his blood boil. But as the anger subsided, something else took its place, something sharper. A resolve. He wasn't going to let this go. Not anymore. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about all the subtle ways people like her had been allowed to trample over others. Over people who didn't have the privilege to fight back. People like him. He could feel the walls of this neighborhood closing in on him. It was supposed to be his escape, a quiet retreat from the battles he'd fought in the CIA. But instead of peace, he found only the bitter taste of exclusion and disdain. It was everywhere, even in the polished facades of these million-dollar homes, where the real fight was hidden just below the surface. Calvin began to take a step he hadn't anticipated. He started documenting. Every time Karen or any other neighbor made a snide comment or crossed the line, he jotted it down. He wasn't a man to waste time or energy on fruitless confrontation, but something had shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let people forget that these microaggressions, these small acts of exclusion, were part of a much larger system. He knew that the only way to make real change was to show just how deep the roots of racism ran. It was a Wednesday afternoon when he saw her again. Karen was out by the pool, this time with her friends, lounging lazily in the sun as though nothing had happened. The audacity of it all made Calvin's stomach turn. How could she just walk around so comfortably in his space as if his boundaries were mere suggestions? He stood in the doorway of his house, staring out at her from the glass windows. His hands tightened around the notepad in his hand. He had it in him to confront her once more. This time, to expose the depth of her entitlement and make her understand that he wasn't going to tolerate it any longer. But before he made his move, he paused. He could feel it. This wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore. It was about drawing a line, about forcing people to confront their own prejudices. Calvin took a deep breath. It was time. He walked outside, his steps firm as he approached the pool area. He didn't look at Karen or her friends immediately. Instead, he took a moment to stand tall, planting himself firmly on the edge of his yard. When Karen saw him, her initial reaction was one of surprise, followed quickly by annoyance. She looked at her friends, then back at Calvin, as if expecting him to back down. "Back again," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Still upset over something so trivial, Calvin stood in silence for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, without a hint of hesitation, he spoke. "I'm not upset, Karen. I'm done being polite. You've crossed the line, and I'm not going to stand by and let it slide anymore." His words were deliberate, calm, but filled with authority. The friends around Karen shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Calvin could see it in their faces, the initial dismissiveness beginning to crumble. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but Calvin cut her off. "You've trespassed on my property again. and I'm done tolerating your excuses. But this isn't just about that. Calvin's voice grew firmer. It's about the way you, and people like you, have made it clear that you believe your privilege gives you the right to act however you want. And I'm telling you now, it's over. Karen's face flushed with anger. What is this? Some kind of lecture, Calvin? You think you can intimidate me with your big words? She scoffed, standing up and placing her hands on her hips. You don't own this place. We all live here. Get over yourself. The others at the pool were silent now, watching, some shifting nervously as the tension rose. But Calvin wasn't backing down. No. Karen, I don't own this place, he said slowly. But I'm demanding respect, just like everyone else here. It's not just about the pool. It's about the way you've treated me, the way you dismiss people like me, as if we don't matter. He took another step forward, standing now within a few feet of her. You may not get it, but your actions have consequences, and I'm holding you accountable. The silence that followed felt heavy, as though everyone present was waiting for the next move. Calvin could hear his heartbeat in his ears, but he stood firm, unwavering. Karen's expression shifted from anger to something else. Embarrassment, maybe shame, or perhaps the recognition that she had underestimated him. Maybe I've been wrong, she muttered, though it sounded less like an apology and more like a deflection. But Calvin wasn't satisfied with her half-hearted attempt at humility. This wasn't just about her apologizing to him. This was about accountability. You can apologize all you want, Calvin said, his voice sharp. But unless you understand why you're wrong and make a conscious effort to change your behavior, it means nothing. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her friends remained silent, their gazes now shifting to each other. Calvin saw it, the shift in power, the moment when the truth started to sink in. I'll be talking to the Homeowners Association about your repeated trespassing, Calvin continued, his voice steady. But this conversation isn't just about property rights. It's about something far bigger than that. It's about you, me, and every person here. How long are we going to let things like this go unchecked? The silence was deafening. Karen's expression hardened, but this time, she couldn't ignore the truth Calvin had thrown in her face. The fight was no longer just about the pool. It was about forcing her, and everyone else who had turned a blind eye, to reckon with their actions. For the first time, Calvin felt the weight of the fight starting to tip in his favor. He wasn't just a man demanding respect anymore. He was a man challenging an entire system of bias, of racism, of privilege. Get your things, Karen, he said, turning to leave. We're done here. As he walked away, Calvin knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was standing on the right side of it. The following days felt strangely surreal for Calvin. What had started as a simple confrontation over a trespassing incident had spiraled into something far more significant, something larger than himself. The tension in the neighborhood had shifted. As he walked to his car, he couldn't help but notice the looks from his neighbors, the hushed conversations that died down the moment he passed by. There was an undeniable change in the air. For the first time in a long while, Calvin felt the weight of those gazes not just on him, but on the system he was now actively challenging. His phone buzzed as he pulled out of his driveway. The message was from Marcus, his old friend from the CIA and now a trusted lawyer. Marcus, I heard about your confrontation. You good? Calvin's lips curled into a slight smile. It wasn't exactly a surprise that Marcus would hear about it so quickly. People in this neighborhood had a way of spreading word faster than he could blink. Calvin typed a quick reply. Calvin, I'm good, but I'm not letting this go. It's time to make some noise. Marcus replied almost immediately. Marcus, I agree. You've got a community here that's been silent for too long. If you want to take action, let me know. I can help. Calvin leaned back in his seat, the weight of Marcus's words settling on him. Make some noise. That was exactly what Calvin needed to do. He wasn't going to let his confrontation with Karen be a one-off moment of fleeting resistance. This was bigger than that. The casual racism he had faced in his life wasn't just something he could forget. It was part of a system, a broken system that needed to be challenged. And he wasn't going to do it alone. 2 days later, Calvin called a community meeting. He had no idea how many people would show up or if anyone even cared, but he knew it was a necessary step. He'd already spoken to a few neighbors who had expressed concern about the way Karen had acted. The ripples were beginning to form, but Calvin wasn't sure how big they would get. He sent out invitations via email and flyers. The meeting was to be held in the small community hall at the center of the neighborhood, a neutral space that people could gather in without feeling threatened. The evening of the meeting arrived, and Calvin walked into the hall, his mind racing with possibilities. As he stood at the front, looking out at the chairs lined up in neat rows, a strange sense of both anticipation and fear settled over him. This was his moment to do more than just fight back personally. This was his chance to spark a movement, to expose the silent racism that had been festering in their community for years. Slowly, people began to trickle in. Neighbors who had once ignored him, or worse, dismissed his existence, now filed in cautiously, eyeing each other in the space. Calvin recognized a few familiar faces, but for the most part, the people present were strangers. Finally, the room filled. Calvin stood before them, his hands clasped in front of him as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," Calvin began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of intensity. "Some of you may know me, others may not. But we're all here tonight for one reason. Because we can no longer pretend that things are as they should be. We can no longer stay silent in the face of systemic racism." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You've heard about the incident with Karen. It wasn't just about her trespassing on my property. It was about the way I've been treated in this community, just like so many others. The way many of us have been treated, simply because of the color of our skin." There was a murmur in the crowd, a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Calvin could feel the weight of their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to say more. Racism isn't always violent. It's not always aggressive. It's often subtle, like the way we're excluded from conversations or ignored in decision-making. It's in the way we're treated as less than, as if we don't belong in spaces where we've earned our place. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can change it. Together. Calvin's voice began to rise, growing in strength as the truth of what he was saying took root. "Tonight, I'm asking you to stand with me, not just for me, but for every single person in this neighborhood who has ever been marginalized, overlooked, or dismissed because of their race. It's time to stop letting these small acts slide. It's time to call out racism for what it is, and it's time to demand better." The room had grown still. Calvin could see the faces in the crowd beginning to shift. Some were nodding along, others were silently reflecting, and a few looked visibly uncomfortable. But the discomfort wasn't enough to silence them now. They were listening, and that was the first step. We need to start talking about racism, about how it shows up in our everyday lives and in our community, Calvin continued. This is about making sure we build a space where we're all equal, a space where nobody has to feel like they don't belong. He looked around the room, his gaze meeting several pairs of eyes. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," Calvin said, his voice softer now. "I'm asking you to take responsibility for the spaces we share. We need to hold each other accountable, and we need to be allies in this fight for justice." As the meeting ended, there was an unexpected sense of unity. People lingered, talking amongst themselves. Calvin's words had sparked something, an acknowledgement that this was no longer just about one person standing up against one act of racism. It was about the collective responsibility of every single person in the room to do better. Calvin felt a glimmer of hope, a feeling that perhaps, just maybe, the fight for social justice could begin right here, right now. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but it had to start somewhere. As people trickled out, Calvin stood in the center of the room, his heart still pounding. He had taken the first step, and it felt like a turning point. The work wasn't over, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The real fight had just begun. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind of emotions for Calvin. The energy from the room lingered, but so did the weight of the challenge ahead. Although a few of his neighbors seemed to genuinely take his words to heart, others remained distant, hesitant to engage fully with the idea of systemic change. The community was divided, and while some were eager to support him, others were still grappling with their own biases, unwilling to confront the realities of racism in their midst. Calvin didn't let this discourage him. He knew that real change would take time. But now that he had opened the door to these difficult conversations, he wasn't going to close it. Not now, not ever. It was a Friday evening when Calvin got the call. He was in his office, sorting through some paperwork, when his phone rang. The name on the screen sent a jolt through him. It was Marcus. "Calvin, you need to get down here," Marcus said quickly, urgency in his voice. "We've got a situation." "What's going on?" Calvin asked, his pulse quickening. "I'm at the HOA meeting. The board's talking about a complaint from Karen about your aggressive behavior. They try to push this through as a reason to get you fined or even force you to move out." Calvin felt his stomach drop. The HOA? Of all the places he thought would be an obstacle, this was the last he expected. It seemed like Karen wasn't letting go of the power she believed she had. "I'll be there in 20, Calvin said, hanging up the phone. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out of the door. He didn't know exactly what Karen had said or how she'd manipulated the situation, but he had a sinking feeling that this was going to be a fight for everything he stood for. When Calvin arrived at the HOA office, he was greeted with the usual cold professionalism. A few people nodded at him, but most were focused on their papers or their phones. He caught sight of Marcus, who gave him a reassuring nod before stepping aside to let Calvin take the floor. The meeting room was filled with the same faces Calvin had seen during the community meeting. Some had shown up to support him, while others wore expressions of indifference, unsure of what to think of the unfolding situation. Karen sat at the front, her face tight with self-righteousness. She was flanked by two other homeowners who had raised similar complaints about Calvin's outburst. Her friends, of course. Calvin could see right through the attempt to paint him as the villain in a story where he was simply trying to assert his right to live peacefully in his own home. I'm sure we're all aware of the recent confrontation between Mr. Morgan and Ms. Watkins. The HOA president began, his voice dry, like he was reciting a script. "It's come to our attention that Mr. Morgan has displayed aggressive behavior, making other homeowners uncomfortable. As per the community rules, such behavior is unacceptable." Calvin could feel the blood rushing to his face, but he held it together. He was used to this. This was just another version of the same kind of treatment he had been enduring all his life. Only now, it was wrapped up in legal jargon and policies that protected the privileged while stifling the voices of those who dared challenge the status quo. Before he could speak, Karen stood, her hand raised dramatically, her voice carrying the kind of certainty only entitlement could afford. "I think it's important to acknowledge that this isn't the first time Mr. Morgan has been aggressive with neighbors," she said, her tone sweet yet condescending. "I've had multiple run-ins with him before, and I've tried to keep it civil, but when someone threatens you in your own home, what do? I'm just trying to protect my family." Calvin's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his composure. Karen's lies were transparent, but the people in the room didn't know him the way he knew her. It was up to him to expose the truth. "Actually," Calvin said, his voice calm but firm, "what Karen's leaving out is the fact that this confrontation didn't begin with me. It started with her trespassing on my property for the second time in a month. I asked her to leave. I didn't threaten her. I didn't raise my voice until she told me I should remember my place." The room fell silent. Karen's eyes narrowed, but Calvin continued. "What I'm asking for is respect. We all pay our dues here, and we all deserve the right to live without being undermined, dismissed, or racially targeted. I've been treated with disrespect, not just by Karen, but by others here who think they can walk all over me because of the color of my skin." The tension in the room thickened as the audience began to shift. Some of the board members glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable, while others were nodding in agreement with Calvin's words. His words had landed. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the power dynamics that existed in this room and in the community. "You can't change what's been ingrained in our community," Calvin continued. "But what I'm asking for today is a chance to start doing things differently. For me, for my family, and for anyone else who has ever felt like their voice didn't matter because of their race." A heavy silence followed. Calvin let the words hang in the air. He wasn't sure if he was going to win this fight. The system was stacked against him, and Karen had her allies. But Calvin didn't need to win this battle in a single meeting. He needed to make them see. Finally, the HOA president cleared his throat. "We'll take everything into consideration," he said, his voice strained. "The board will convene and make a decision." Calvin walked out of the room with his head held high, but his heart was still heavy. He knew that this was just one battle in a long war against racism and inequality. He had exposed something, the privilege and entitlement that people like Karen carried with them every day, and that alone felt like a small victory. As he stepped out into the parking lot, Marcus caught up with him. "You did good, Calvin," Marcus said, a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got the community's attention now." "I'm not stopping," Calvin said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been pushed down, ignored, dismissed. We're going to make them listen." The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The following weeks were a whirlwind of uncertainty as Calvin awaited the HOA's decision on the complaint. He had expected some pushback, but what he hadn't anticipated was the silence that followed his bold declaration. The community had grown quiet, too quiet. The conversations that once filled the streets seemed to have dissipated, leaving a tense stillness in their wake. As Calvin walked to his mailbox one morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had become more accustomed to the uncomfortable glances, the hushed whispers, and the passive-aggressive gestures from his neighbors. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. It felt like the entire community was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. It was a Saturday when the letter arrived. He stood in his kitchen, staring at the envelope in his hand, unsure of what it contained. His pulse quickened, and he tore it open. The letter was from the HOA president, and as Calvin read through the formalities of the first few paragraphs, his stomach tightened. The words felt like a punch in the gut. Following a thorough review of the incident with Karen Watkins, and after hearing both parties' concerns, the board has come to a decision regarding the matter. As of this meeting, no formal action will be taken against either party. We strongly encourage both Mr. Morgan and Ms. Watkins to resolve this matter privately, as it is a matter of community respect and cooperation. Calvin's grip on the letter tightened. The board had sided with Karen. They had done nothing. This was exactly what he had feared. The dismissal of his concerns, his very real experience with racism, as something trivial to be swept under the rug. No consequences for Karen. No accountability. Just a vague, impotent suggestion that they both resolve it privately. His heart raced as he reread the letter. The disappointment was overwhelming. The words were hollow, and the more he read them, the more it became clear that nothing had changed. No one was listening. The community had failed him again. But then, a voice inside him, faint but persistent, told him he couldn't stop. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't about his house or his reputation. It was about the countless others who had been silenced before him. The ones who didn't have the resources to challenge the system. The ones who were still too afraid to speak up. He took a deep breath, setting the letter down on the counter. He didn't know what the next step would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The next few days saw Calvin putting his plan into action. He began to reach out to his neighbors again. This time, not with anger or frustration, but with a clearer focus. He wanted to build alliances, to bring people together, and to show them that this wasn't just about one person's experience. It was about a community standing up against injustice. He reached out to a few people he had spoken to during the community meeting. There were some who had expressed support, but hadn't been vocal in the aftermath. Others had seemed genuinely interested, but hadn't known how to help. Calvin decided it was time to bring them into the fold, to form a united front. If he could organize a collective effort, if he could show the HOA and the rest of the neighborhood that people were willing to stand together, maybe, just maybe, there would be real change. A week later, Calvin held a second meeting. This time, he didn't just focus on his own story. He invited others to speak. Neighbors who had been affected by racism, microaggressions, and prejudice. He wanted them to share their experiences, to create a platform where their voices could be heard. The room was smaller than the first one, but there were more faces this time. People who had been too hesitant before, but now felt the strength of collective action. There was Sarah, a a young mother who had been subjected to racial profiling at a local store. There was Joseph, a teacher who had been passed over for promotions despite his qualifications. And then there was Isabel, an immigrant who had been treated with disdain by others in the neighborhood because of her accent. Each story was different, but the thread that ran through them was the same: the quiet, insidious ways racism showed up in their lives, in their communities, and in their workplaces. When it was Calvin's turn to speak, he didn't focus on his confrontation with Karen. Instead, he spoke about what it meant to fight for systemic change. He talked about the power of solidarity, about how they could be the ones to change the narrative if they stood together. "We've all been affected by this," Calvin said, his voice steady but passionate. "This isn't just about one person or one incident. It's about making sure that no one has to walk through life feeling like their humanity is up for debate. This is our fight." The room was quiet, save for the occasional sniffle and the soft murmurs of agreement. But Calvin could feel it. There was a spark in the air, a collective energy, a force that had been dormant but was now awake. By the end of the meeting, they had a plan. They would approach the HOA again, this time with the voices of the community behind them. They would demand action, and if the HOA refused to listen, they would escalate it to the media, to organizations that fought for civil rights. They would not back down. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Flyers were distributed, phone calls were made, and meetings were scheduled. The momentum was building, and Calvin felt like he was on the verge of something big. On the evening of the next HOA meeting, Calvin stood outside the hall, his heart pounding with anticipation. This time, he wasn't alone. The room was packed with his neighbors. Every person who had shared their story, every ally who had stepped forward to fight for change. They were ready to demand justice, ready to be heard. As the meeting began, the board members looked visibly uncomfortable. They hadn't expected this level of turnout, this level of organized opposition. Karen, who had been at the front of the room before, now sat at the back, visibly tense. The power had shifted. Calvin stepped to the front, his voice loud and clear as he addressed the board. "We're here to tell you that this isn't over. We've had enough of being ignored. We've had enough of being treated as if our voices don't matter. If you don't take action, if you don't stand with us, we'll take this to the next level. This community deserves better." The tension in the room was palpable. The board members exchanged nervous glances, but this time they couldn't hide behind bureaucracy or avoidance. They had to face the truth that Calvin and his neighbors were united, and they weren't going to back down. The room was heavy with anticipation as the board members sat in stunned silence. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Calvin to show up again, not only with his own voice, but with the voices of an entire community backing him. The sheer number of people in the room was undeniable, and for the first time, the board had no choice but to confront the issue head-on. Calvin stood tall, unwavering, as he waited for the board to respond. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, and while the pressure was immense, it also fueled him. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. This wasn't just about a dispute between neighbors anymore. It was about everything he had worked for in his life, about finally demanding equality in a world that had spent too long pushing him aside. The HOA president, visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. "Mr. Morgan, we appreciate your passion and the concerns of your neighbors. However, we have rules and guidelines that must be followed. We cannot condone what was perceived as aggressive behavior, nor can we allow any disruptions to the peaceful nature of our community." A few murmurs from the crowd began to rise as the president continued, but Calvin raised his hand to signal for calm. He wasn't done yet. Disruption? Calvin's voice was calm, but it carried authority. "What you're calling a disruption is me standing up for myself and for every person in this community who has been silently suffering because of the subtle, insidious forms of racism that you seem so eager to overlook." There was a collective gasp from the room. For a moment, everything fell quiet. The president shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We don't condone racism here, Mr. Morgan. We're simply trying to maintain the peace." "You're maintaining the peace for whom?" Calvin's words cut through the room like a knife. You're maintaining the peace for the people who walk around here, using their privilege to dismiss, to belittle, and to invalidate people like me. You're protecting the status quo, while people like me fight every day just to be treated with basic respect. Calvin paused, his gaze sweeping the room. He could see the discomfort on the faces of the board members, but there were also people in the crowd who nodded, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to understanding. He had their attention now, and he wasn't going to let it go to waste. This isn't just about one incident with Karen, Calvin continued, his voice rising, gaining strength with every word. This is about a system that allows people to walk around thinking they're better than others because of the color of their skin. This is about the microaggressions, the assumptions, the subtle biases that people like Karen carry with them every single day. This is about every black person, every person of color who has been told their concerns don't matter. The president sat back in his chair, his eyes shifting between Calvin and the crowd. It was clear that the board hadn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. Karen, still sitting in the back, now looked uncomfortable, her smugness fading as she realized the depth of what was happening. You can't keep pretending like these issues don't exist, Calvin said, his tone softer but no less intense. And you can't keep turning a blind eye. We're done with being invisible. The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time, it felt like the power dynamic had shifted. The people who had once remained silent, who had once allowed Karen's actions to slide, were now looking at each other, questioning the choices they had made. Calvin had given them the courage to confront their own biases. Finally, one of the board members, a middle-aged man who had been silent until now, spoke up. Calvin, I didn't realize it was this serious. We've ignored these issues for too long, and I think it's time we start listening. His words were simple, but they had a profound effect. One by one, the other board members began to nod. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. They couldn't ignore what Calvin was saying any longer. The president cleared his throat, his posture now a little less stiff. We'll take your concerns seriously, Mr. Morgan. The board will discuss it further and come up with a solution that better addresses the concerns of all our residents. Calvin felt a glimmer of hope, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real work wasn't going to come from just a few words or a decision by the HOA. It was going to take a long, sustained effort to dismantle the racism that still ran deep in the community. He could feel it in his bones. The work was just beginning. As the meeting ended, Calvin stood with his head held high, his heart pounding. He had made an impact, but the fight wasn't over. He turned to Marcus, who was standing nearby, and gave him a nod. We've got their attention, Calvin said, his voice determined. Now, it's up to us to make sure they do something about it. Marcus nodded in agreement. We'll make sure they do more than just talk. This is just the first step. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. The HOA began to take more concrete steps toward addressing the issues that had been raised. They held additional meetings to discuss the implementation of anti-racism workshops and to create a more inclusive environment within the community. They also made plans to establish a grievance process where residents could report any instances of discrimination or bias they experienced. But Calvin knew that change wouldn't come overnight. Even with the HOA's promises, the real test was how the community responded. Would they back up their words with action? Would they truly make the effort to address the systemic racism that Calvin had exposed? The process was slow, but as he watched the neighborhood slowly begin to shift, more people of color feeling comfortable speaking up, more white allies stepping forward, Calvin felt a sense of hope. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or ignored. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. One evening, as Calvin sat on his porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills, he received another message from Marcus. Marcus, we're making progress, but this is just the beginning. You started something, Calvin. It's time to keep pushing. Calvin smiled as he looked out over the neighborhood. The fight wasn't over, but it had taken a huge step forward. He had made his stand, and in doing so, he had sparked something bigger than himself. It was time to keep pushing, not just for his own justice, but for the justice of everyone who needed it. The road ahead was long, but Calvin was ready. As Calvin continued to push for change in his community, the momentum began to grow. The ripple effect from the HOA meeting was undeniable. There were more conversations, more gatherings, and more people reaching out to him with their own stories of discrimination and racial bias. His fight had become something larger than just one man's struggle. It had become a movement. Calvin had always known that real change wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, gradual process. But as he sat at the kitchen table one evening, going over notes for his next steps, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of pride. The community was starting to change. More residents were beginning to openly acknowledge the subtle ways racism existed, not just in their lives, but in the structures that governed their daily interactions. It was a start, but Calvin knew it was just a small step. He had received a message earlier that day from one of his neighbors, Jasmine, a young activist who had attended the first community meeting. She was eager to take their fight beyond the HOA and begin organizing events to educate others about racism and privilege. Jasmine had grown up in the neighborhood, and she had seen firsthand how race played a role in shaping opportunities and relationships. She was the kind of ally that Calvin had been hoping for, a fierce advocate willing to push for change even when it wasn't popular. "We need to take this to the streets," Jasmine had said in her message. "I'm organizing a rally to raise awareness about systemic racism and to demand better from our community leaders. I want you to be a part of it." Calvin had been hesitant at first. He knew the risks involved in organizing a public demonstration. But Jasmine's passion and commitment were undeniable. She had a way of making him believe in the possibility of real change, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The rally took place 2 weeks later, on a crisp Saturday morning. It was held in the town square, a central location that had been a gathering place for decades. Calvin, along with Jasmine and other members of the community, stood at the front, ready to address the crowd. As the people began to gather, the air buzzed with anticipation. There was a sense of urgency, of solidarity that hadn't been there before. Calvin looked around at the sea of faces. Some he knew well, others were strangers. But it didn't matter. Today, they were all here for the same reason. They were here to demand justice. The rally began with speeches. Local leaders, activists, and even a few people who had been affected by racial bias in the community took turns speaking. Some told their stories of prejudice they had endured, while others called for action. Calvin's heart swelled with pride as he listened to their words. They were standing together, united by a common cause. When it was Calvin's turn to speak, the crowd fell silent. He stepped up to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the people before him. He felt the weight of the moment, the responsibility of standing before these people who had come to support him, to support the cause. "Thank you all for being here," Calvin began, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "Today, we're not just standing here for ourselves. We're standing here for every person who has ever been silenced because of their race. We're standing here for every individual who has been told that their experience, their pain, their humanity doesn't matter. Today, we're saying enough is enough." The crowd erupted into applause, and Calvin's heart pounded in his chest. But he didn't let the applause distract him. He was here for something bigger. "We're here because we want to create a world where no one has to be afraid to speak their truth," Calvin continued. "A world where our children can grow up in a community that values them for who they are, not for the color of their skin. This fight is not just about us. It's about the future. It's about the kind of world we want to leave behind." As he spoke, Calvin could feel the energy of the crowd shifting. The tension, the uncertainty that had once been there, was starting to dissipate. People were no longer standing on the sidelines. They were in this fight with him. The anger, the frustration, the years of feeling unheard. It was all beginning to coalesce into something powerful. "But," Calvin added, his voice growing softer, "we can't do this alone. This fight requires all of us. It requires white allies standing alongside black and brown communities. It requires everyone in this community to do the hard work of dismantling the systems that have been built to keep some of us down. And it requires us to show up day after day, even when it feels like we're not making a difference. He paused, letting the words sink in. We will make a difference. It won't happen overnight, but I'm asking each of you here today to commit to this fight, to commit to the long road ahead, to commit to building a community where equality and justice are more than just words. They're a reality. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Calvin's heart swelled. He knew that today was a milestone, a turning point. But he also knew that the work wasn't done. It was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, the rally became a catalyst for broader change. The local media picked up on the event, and the conversation about systemic racism began to spread beyond their small neighborhood. Local leaders reached out to Calvin and Jasmine to discuss how they could collaborate on future initiatives. People who had once been passive bystanders were now actively engaged in conversations about privilege, power, and responsibility. But Calvin didn't stop there. He continued to push for systemic change at every level, from the HOA to local businesses, schools, and institutions. The fight was exhausting, and there were times when the setbacks felt insurmountable. But Calvin refused to let go of the vision he had for his community. He refused to let racism continue to be a silent force that dictated the lives of so many people. One evening, as Calvin sat in his living room, reflecting on everything that had happened, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Marcus standing there, a wide grin on his face. "You've done it, man," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. "People are talking. People are changing." Calvin smiled, but he wasn't done yet. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's so much more to do." Marcus nodded. "And we'll be right here with you. You've sparked something, Calvin. Don't let it die." Calvin's gaze shifted to the window, where the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the neighborhood. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Calvin felt hopeful. He had started a movement, and as long as he had the support of his community, he wasn't backing down. The months following the rally passed in a whirlwind of activity. The momentum didn't die after that day. If anything, it only grew stronger. More meetings were held, more conversations ignited, and perhaps most significantly, more voices were raised. Calvin continued to be a central figure in these discussions, his involvement serving as both a catalyst and a symbol for the change they were fighting for. But even as the community began to feel a sense of progress, Calvin knew that the fight was far from over. The deeper, more entrenched systems of racism were still alive and well, lingering in the crevices of society. They had seen the impact of one conversation, one movement, one rally. But now it was time to sustain it, to push harder, and to reach further. One evening, Calvin was sitting at his kitchen table when his phone buzzed. It was Marcus again. "Marcus, you need to see this." The urgency in his message was palpable. Calvin clicked on the link Marcus had sent. His heart sank as he read the headline. Protests erupt after incident at local grocery store. Black man accused of shoplifting, forced to prove his innocence. He quickly clicked through to the story. The details were all too familiar. A black man had been accused of shoplifting in the same grocery store where Calvin frequently shopped, despite having done nothing wrong. The store's security had detained him, forcing him to prove his innocence in front of other customers. Once again, it was a case of racial profiling, an innocent man being treated like a criminal because of his skin color. Calvin's mind raced. It felt like a slap in the face, as though all the progress they had made had been erased in an instant. He could feel the old frustration building again, that familiar feeling of being powerless in a world that refused to see him as an equal. But this time, Calvin wasn't going to let it slide. He had worked too hard to build momentum in the community, to raise awareness, to get people talking about racism, only to have it all undone by an incident like this. He wasn't going to let the community fall back into silence. He picked up his phone and dialed Marcus. "Get the word out," Calvin said, his voice steady with determination. "We need to organize. We need to take this to the streets again." The next morning, Calvin and Marcus went to the grocery store to gather more information about what had happened. They were met by a crowd of people gathered outside, some protesting, others discussing the incident in hushed tones. Calvin could feel the energy shift in the air. The anger and frustration were palpable, but so was the sense of solidarity. People had had enough. Inside the store, Calvin asked to speak to the manager. The conversation wasn't easy. The manager was defensive, denying that the incident had anything to do with racial profiling, but Calvin could see through the excuses. "This isn't about the store," Calvin said firmly. "This is about a broken system that continues to treat black people like criminals. Your store may have made a mistake, but that mistake is part of a much larger issue. And if you don't take responsibility, we'll make sure the community knows about it." The manager was reluctant, but after some tense back and forth, they agreed to schedule a meeting to address the issue. Calvin knew this wasn't going to be an easy fix, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, Calvin returned to the community center to organize another meeting. The protests were already beginning to gather steam, and the public was rallying behind the man who had been wrongfully accused. But this wasn't just about one individual. It was about making sure everyone knew this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a product of a system that treated black and brown people as expendable, as less than. At the meeting, Calvin stood before a group of neighbors who had gathered in solidarity. They had come to show their support, but they had also come with a shared mission: to ensure that this incident wasn't swept under the rug. Calvin's voice rang clear as he addressed them all. "This is it," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This is what we've been fighting for. Every time something like this happens, it's easy for people to ignore it, to push it aside. But we can't let that happen. We're not going to let it slide." The room was filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. The energy was electric, the resolve in the room unmistakable. Calvin had a plan, and now it was time to execute it. They organized a march to the grocery store, one that would take their message to the people who needed to hear it the most. They weren't going to stop until the store apologized publicly, until they acknowledged the racial bias that had fueled the incident, and until they made changes to their policies to prevent something like this from ever happening again. As the march took to the streets, the number of people who showed up surprised even Calvin. It was no longer just about him or about the black community. It was about the collective fight for justice. People from all backgrounds, races, and walks of life marched together, united in their belief that what had happened was wrong. The grocery store had no choice but to take notice. 2 weeks later, the store issued a public apology. They agreed to implement new training programs for their staff, focused on racial bias and community engagement. The community had won, not just because of the apology, but because they had forced the system to confront itself. This victory wasn't just about a store taking responsibility. It was about the power of the people coming together, standing in solidarity and demanding change. As Calvin stood in front of the store, watching the protesters disperse and the media coverage spread, he felt a sense of pride. This wasn't just a victory for him. This was a victory for everyone who had stood by his side, for everyone who had marched, and for everyone who had refused to stay silent. But Calvin knew the fight wasn't over. He still had a long road ahead of him, and there would be more battles to face. But today, for this moment, they had won, and that was enough to keep pushing forward. Change starts with us, but it doesn't end here. Calvin's fight for justice isn't just a story. It's a reflection of the daily struggles countless individuals face in our society. As we continue to confront racism and systemic inequality, we need your voice. Speak up. Stand against injustice in your community. Challenge the biases, both big and small, that continue to hurt marginalized communities. Be an ally. If you see something, say something. Amplify voices that have been silenced. Get involved, whether it's marching, writing, or simply having difficult conversations. Every action matters. This fight for racial justice requires all of us. Together, we can dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality and create a world where justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone. Join the movement. Support anti-racism initiatives, educate yourself and others, and take tangible steps to create lasting change. The time for silence is over. Let's make sure every voice is heard. Start today. Speak out. Act now.